Welcome to Bricklayer. In this video, I'm going to show you some artifacts that can be created using level 3 put functions. So in the upper left one here, what you can do is you can start out by creating a square, a blue square, and place it. And then you can place inside that blue square, you can place the yellow square that's a little bit smaller. And then inside that yellow square, you can place a blue square and yellow square and blue square, and then finally you end with a yellow square. So in order to do that, I'd like to point out a couple of things. The side of the squares get smaller by 2, so 1 on each side every single time. And then the coordinates, the reference point for the put functions are going to be 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, and 5, 5. So you get this cool pattern that comes out of this. Now you can kind of play around with that idea, and you can build two different squares side by side or sort of overlapping, and then depending on the order in which you create the squares, how they overlap, the kind of pattern that shows up, you can control that a little bit. So you can do kind of fun things this way. You can do this with 3 squares or 4 squares and stuff, and they come out looking pretty cool. Now, in concept 13, we talked about circles and rings. And so in concept 14 now, we talked about rectangles, arbitrarily shaped rectangles. And so you can kind of combine these ideas and start coding up letters. Now, the top one, Bricklayer, has a couple of diagonal lines in it, the letter K and the letter Y. So we haven't learned how to do that yet. In an easy way. You could always brute force it, but concept 15 talks about lines, and that lets us do stuff like this. So except for the letter K and Y, everything else that you see here can be coded using a combination of put functions and rings. So notice, for example, let me just say one thing about the letter C. So you create a ring, and then you can use a put function using the empty brick to erase part of that ring and make it look like the letter C. Here's another interesting idea. You can start out by placing 2 black squares inside a grid, and then that leaves over and then you have 2 empty spaces, right, on the upper left and the lower right. And in those empty spaces, you can again place 2 squares along this diagonal, lower left and upper right, and you can keep doing this. And at some point you have to stop, and it kind of how often you can do this depends a little bit on, well, depends on how big your grid is to begin with. Here's another idea that's kind of related to that. And so you start out with a grid. So these are just put each line and each vertical line and each horizontal line here is a single put function. So you create this grid, step 1. And then step 2 is you create a bigger grid on top of the grid that you just created. So in this case, every other grid line now becomes part of your newer, bigger grid. And the newer, bigger grid, the lines themselves are fatter. And then you can do that again. You get the pattern shown in the bottom here. Technically speaking, this is a fractal. You can do some fun stuff in level 4 when you get to 3-dimensional stuff. So this is the Rubik's Cube. And I would like to point out a fun fact about the coloring scheme of the Rubik's Cube. So the Rubik's Cube that you'll typically buy in a store here in the United States, the color scheme is called minus yellow. And basically, it's an algorithm for figuring out the color of the opposite side of the cube. So if on the bottom of the cube is white, then if you add yellow to white, you get yellow, and that's the color that's on the top of the cube. And similarly, if you subtract yellow from the top of the cube, the face on the top of the cube, it's yellow, you get white. And so you can do this formula, this plus and minus, adding yellow for red and blue. So red plus yellow is orange. So what that means is on the opposite side of this cube where red is, the back side is orange. And similarly, on the back side of the blue, the opposite side to the blue side is going to be green. And then here, if you want, you can do some really advanced stuff, but this truly is advanced, and this is level 5 stuff. But you can kind of combine the idea of circles and rings, where you have, where you have circles and squares, where you have squares that are sort of being rotated in a circular fashion around a particular point.